Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who may be listening, and hello also to anyone who may be tuning in. In this video I'm going to continue with a short discussion on the book that I have just brought out, Shi'i Spirituality for the 21st century, which is a collection of about 20 lectures that I've given over the last 10 years, plus 2 academic articles that are a little bit more philosophical. I'm going to continue to consider or reflect upon some of the points that were made in chapter 1 of this book, which is transforming our way of being, and what that actually means. So I will recap a little bit from the previous video where I'm talking about, like I said, a way of being. What do we mean by a way of being? And we could say that Islam is a mode of existing in the world, a way of approaching reality and living with reality. A way of being is also a mentality, and that mentality is rooted in a perception of reality. Our mentality, the way that we think, our psychology, our understanding of what existence is, which then influences our character, our way of being in the world, is rooted in how we perceive reality. So if we are to transform ourselves, of course we need to consider what we want to transform ourselves into, but if we want to transform ourselves into people of knowledge, people of insight, people who have imbibed the higher knowledge that has been transmitted by the prophets, then we need to consider how we perceive the world and how we perceive this existence. Oftentimes, like I said maybe in the previous video, while Muslims may fast and pray and carry out the external practices of Islam, their way of thinking is essentially secular. We are meant to be rooted in a consciousness of the finite nature of this existence, in the ephemeral nature of this worldly life, and we are supposed to have an intimate acquaintance with death. As some philosophers have said, the secular way of life somehow doesn't like the idea of death. I remember reading this, I wish I could remember which work I read this in, but it was a point that stuck out for me, which is that secular society pushes death to the margins. Death is kind of kept out of the picture of our general daily life, and on further reflection, perhaps that's possible in wealthier societies where we somehow see slightly less death. In societies where there is a lot of death, let's say infant mortality, women dying in childbirth, war, famine, disease, where death is very common, then there is a kind of culture of embracing death with courage and acceptance, and from that arises further reflections about the nature of our existence and how we can live in this life with wisdom in preparation for the time that our life will be taken away from us at any moment. We know that in the 19th century in the West, there was a culture of death in the sense of a lot of rituals to do with funerals and mourning, and if someone was in mourning, then they would be dressed in a certain way, they would wear certain clothes, there was a particular mourning period, and the dead would be frequently remembered. We still have this in Islamic culture. This was something that I saw when I was traveling in Muslim countries before I converted, that I noticed that even gatherings for the deceased were held in the street. I like this living in the street. I think that life, when it's lived on the street, is so much more human. It opens up for a more dynamic way of living, a more dynamic interaction. When we're all shut away behind walls, that doesn't really allow for the human spirit to flourish somehow. It also means that whatever way of life we practice, especially a spiritual way of life, if we're trying to live a spiritual way of life, that doesn't really filter out onto the street. The streets, especially again in our secularized Western nations, the streets are places for department stores and places for shops and supermarkets and traffic, and people who are coming home tired from work, or people who are tired going to work. So our streets in our cities in particular are places of stress, materialism, and people generally being focused inward in order to try to preserve some kind of sanity and in order to be able to function in a crowded environment that is crowded on public transport. If we have remembrances of death on our streets, funerals, janazas, majalis, that then inculcates the spirit of the next world, or the remembrance of the next world, into the world of the living. There is this connection between the next world and this world. And this is what I have noticed in majority Muslim countries, where death is, like I said, remembered on the street. We also have the call to prayer that is public. The call to prayer is a call to us to remember the shortness of this life, that we are going to leave this world, that there are other worlds out there waiting for us. These constant remembrances or constant reminders that there are literally parallel to our material world other worlds to which we're going to go, connects our material world to the next world. There is a dynamic interaction between the next world and this world. Whereas if we marginalize the remembrance of death and the remembrance of this shortness of life, we remember our dead, we remember our deceased in the margins of our lifestyle, not publicly, they're not remembered, gatherings are not held, they're no longer spoken about because it's kind of awkward to speak about someone who's passed away, so let's just not talk about them, which is more or less what's happened in 21st century Europe. When the deceased are marginalized, when death is marginalized, and the material world is foregrounded, and there's not really any particular conception of the next world, any thought of the next world, or any preparation for the next world, essentially we are stuck in this bubble of our material world. That's all there is. And yes, we can have a kind of a dynamic way of life in this material world, but we have